Here we have an RB20DET. So this one's come out of an R32 Skyline GTST, and it's with us today just for a general refresh. So there was nothing wrong with this engine when it came out. All of the compression was good. The car's having other work done, and it's here with me to generally have a refresh. So we'll pull it apart, check the state of the cylinder bores, we'll inspect the bearings. We can measure the rings for clearance to the cylinder walls. We'll generally go through everything, tidy it up, generally give it a good refresh. Probably we'll replace the belt, timing belt and water pump thermostat maybe, but we'll pull it apart and we'll see what we've got. And yeah, hopefully this is kind of a relaxing video to watch, and hopefully will help you if you need to take one of these RB20s apart. So enjoy. So one CAS unit here, still have the half mean intact. This O-ring will need to be replaced when it goes back in, but spins freely, so no issues with this one. So the nut to turn the crank is a 27mm bolt. The alternator and pass pumps can be moved with 12 and 14mm sockets or spanners. And to take the viscous clutch off the water pump pulley, we're using a 10mm spanner. Something that's really nice on this one is there's no cracking here. So on a lot of these fans now, you have cracking on the fan hub in between the fins, but this one's in really good condition with no cracks, so that's great. So here's the bolt for the crank. So this is 27. These are normally seized on here pretty good, so we'll leave this for now. We'll get a puller to grab this off, but to give us a bit more room and a bit more space, we'll take the pass pump and the alternator, which does not sound great, off. So the bearings are gone in this. So one pass pump, 2 ports for high CAS. We can also go ahead and remove this bracket as well. So from memory it's 3 bolts. So here's your pass mounting bracket. So to remove the alternator, first we need to unplug the wiring. First one large plug. Next we have a little nut for the positive post, which is 10mm. We have another earthing strap, which from memory is 8mm, I think. So we'll try an 8. Yeah, 8mm, which is a very small fastener. Just be careful with this 8mm that it doesn't seize and snap off in the aluminium casing of the alternator. It's a very small bolt. So now we have one more, also 8mm connector, which attaches the wiring loom for the alternator to the back of the alternator. Again, very small fastener, so be careful with that one, he says, using an impact gun. But now we can remove the alternator. I don't know if I said before, but 2 of the bolts are shared with the water pump, so we'll put those back in when they're out. So often corrosion if the water pump is leaking past the gasket internally, so keep an eye out for these. So make sure you keep hold of the spacer, which sits in here. Obviously, as you can tell, we're going to need to clean this bolt up. And that's the nut. It's this odd shape because this will contact the block, which lets you turn this and effectively turns this into a captive nut. So let me grab a puller for this and we'll be back in a second. So these are M6 holes. So this isn't cutting, this is just chasing, and we're just taking the rust out of these holes. So I'm using 2 M6 bolts with a stack of washers, which isn't ideal, but what we need to do is make this base wide enough to fit on the puller. So it's best not to use the 3-jaw pullers because, I don't know if you can see, but that happens, you'll chip the harmonic balancer and then it won't be harmonically balanced. So we need to be using a proper hub puller, like this, otherwise you're going to have problems. Okay, so here's one I've got set up. So we've got both of the bolts in. This is still free to move, and the crank bolt for the pulley is still in place. It's important that you press on that bolt. So we'll take it by the tension by hand, and then we'll start working on this. Previously these haven't been too bad to get off. The crank gear for the timing belt is another story. On all of the RB20s that I've rebuilt, I've only managed to get one off without having to drill and tap it to pull it, effectively destroying it. So they're not fun to take off on this engine at all. I think on 25s and 26s it's normally not too bad, but for some reason on the RB20s they seem really, really difficult to get off. So I can already feel this is starting to come, so that's a good sign. Now, when you're doing this, be careful. If you feel it tighten up, it might just be tightening itself on the head of the bolt. So back the bolt further out before you keep going, or at least check that you're not stuck on that. So there you go, that's now off, drama free. So as I was saying before, you can see the chip here, more than likely, not saying it is, but normally that's what happens when you're using one of the 3-jaw pullers to pull on this lip. And these are not very strong, and they will break like this. But the good news is we don't have any tears or rips in the rubber harmonic part of this, so theoretically should be okay to use again. So now we'll take the timing cover off and we'll see how we're looking under here. So these two Allen bolts here are 5mm. This centre is 8. This outside is an 8mm. And this is also an 8mm. So they are supposed to have rubber washers on them, but every RB I've seen, it just turns to plastic and disintegrates. So definitely worth replacing. So I can see that we've got an OEM Nissan timing belt fitted, which is a good sign. But it's also covered in leaves and debris, which is not so good. So we'll keep going and pull the lower cover off next. So yeah, OEM Nissan belt. These are, I know these are NSK idler and tensioner bearings, so those are OEM as well. So it's a good sign. Tension feels good. So you shouldn't really be able to twist it 90 degrees, or just about twist it 90 degrees. So I'm happy with this setting, so that looks good for me. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to vacuum out the top of the gallery here. Going to take the coil pack covers off. I'm going to take the spark plugs out. Then we're going to rotate this to TDC, and then we can take the timing belt off. So these are all 12mm for the coil pack rail. So there you have the two coil pack rails. We'll just vacuum this out now. So we'll break the spark plugs off by hand first. So I'm not sure if these have been out previously, but they're not very tight. So let's hope they have been. So let's see what these can tell us. So cylinder 1, looking pretty good. So these are BCP R6ES, so I think we'll be going a little bit colder, maybe 7s with what we'll put back in, but no cracks. Wear looks pretty even. Gap looks a bit small actually, by eye, but we can measure it. But 1 looks okay. Again, 2, not too bad, but it looks like 2 was slightly richer than 1. So comparing, so 3 looks a little bit leaner, maybe a little bit hotter in that one. 4, probably the same as 3. 5, same. And a 6, which normally runs hot a little bit in RBs, is kind of the same as 3 and 4, but nothing too bad. All the spark plugs are at least matching, so it's a good start. So now what I'm going to do is turn this over to TDC. So we can check TDC. So there's a mark here on this cam and a mark on this back plate here, and the same on the exhaust cam, and there's a mark on the crank pulley as well. Based on these two being lined up, we at least hope that the other one is lined up as well. So now we'll take the tensioner off. So we can use an Allen key here to control it. We're not going to do that right now. I'm just going to let it slowly spring back, but you could use the Allen key. So what I've done there is just detension it, which will help us remove this belt easily. Very important to refit this when we're doing timing belts. and we keep the smooth side on the inside. And this is what keeps the timing belt on the crank pulley. If you forget to put this on, the belt will walk forwards, and likewise there's one at the back. If you forget that one, it will try and walk backwards, so really important to remember these. So here you have your timing belt. So we can inspect now for any damage, but to be honest, this looks really good. Yep, so OEM Nissan. No production date, unfortunately. Would have been nice to know that. So now we can remove our idler and tensioner. So it's important these washers go back in the correct order. So you've got a flat and then a spring. There's your spring. So it's a 14mm for the tensioner and 17 for the idler. So bearings in both of those feel really good, so that's a good sign. As I said with these crank pulleys, I feel like this is going to be quite a difficult one, so we'll see where we need to go with that one, but for now I'm going to leave that where it is. Remove the cast bracket now. So these are all 12mm bolts. This is held on with a dowel, which is sometimes doesn't like to give up, so it might take a bit of effort trying to get that off. So there is a pry spot around the back, so you just kind of have to work it backwards and forwards until it comes loose. Then you've worked a bit of a gap up, you can sneak a screwdriver in the back. This might need a little bit of tapping backwards and forwards. Hopefully we've got it now. There you go, so it just sits in these two dowels here, but they can seize up with time, so sometimes take a bit of work to get it out. So for me, now I like to remove the cam gears and remove this backing plate so that we're nearly done on the front of the engine. For some reason the bolt size on these is 11mm, not sure why. Nissan very rarely use 11mm. Obviously just be careful when you're doing this because you don't want to spin the cam. A little bit of movement is okay, but you really don't want to spin it, so using an impact gun is ideal for this. So these are also held on with a dowel, which can be a little bit tricky to get out, so these are kind of seized on. But these normally aren't too bad. Then we'll just make a marking I for intake on the inside of this one. Much better. And then we'll do E for exhaust on this one. So this cover should be 2 10mm and 2 12s, I think. 3 10s and 1 12. So I'm not sure where this was stored, but we have some nice nutshells. Don't know when these got in here. So I'll have to ask whether it was near any squirrels at any point, or rats. But either way, we don't need these in an RB. So we're kind of getting into the messy stuff now at the front of the engine. So if we're going to look at taking the water pump off, the thermostat housing off, I know this still has oil in it because it was never drained. So what I'm going to do now is just probably go around and take a few of the loose gaskets and brackets off, and we'll just tidy up what we're working with. We need to come and take a look at this wiring and remove that. So I'll start on the brackets, I'll move on to the wiring before we start making any fluid messes. So I've just done the exhaust side engine mount. We'll take the driver's side engine mount off. So these are just held on with 14mm bolts. They should be held on with 4. This one's held on with 3, so I'm not sure what happened with the fourth one there. I'm going to come around to this side now, and we'll try and tackle some of the coolant piping here and the wiring. So we'll start with the wiring because I don't really want to get any coolant in that, and we'll see how we get on from there. So knock sensor number 1. And number 2, and these come on a separate loom. So now we can take off the oil pressure. So these are reusable zip ties, so you don't need to cut these. And there you have the engine loom. So now we're going to take these coolant hoses off. So this is a really good sign. Sometimes this is rotted through, but on this one it looks pretty good. So normally these kind of coolant clips are normally around 7mm, but for some reason Nissan's at 8s. So just something to be aware of. Never had much luck getting these out in one piece. I find it's easier to take this piece off. It's sounding pretty crunchy in here, so I'll have to be careful. So definitely still got a bit of coolant in it. So we'll let any more dribble out. And we'll try and get this hose off without crunching the fitting. If you can get the hose turning, it's normally a good sign. So it's got a bit of the crusties here, but I've definitely seen worse. So let's pop off the thermostat housing now, and we'll see what lies in there. So this will be siliconed on from the factory. It's alley as well, so be careful not to break it. Just a few light taps should do. So a bit of rust and a bit of, I don't know what that is. Not nice stuff though. Then I like to take the thermostat out with a screwdriver. So we might get some coolant here. No, just rust. Just rusty water. That is not nice. We'll save ourselves some trouble for later and let that eat that. So now we've done our thermostat, we'll have a go at our water pump. So this should be a mixture of 12s, 14s and 110. So we can use 2 screwdrivers to try and pull this or prise this pump off. So just use an up and down motion. We don't want to put too much stress in one direction. and you'll start to hear the silicone peel, which I have heard, so brilliant. More Fausty water for us. You can see that some of the blades are starting to corrode, and yeah, got some crystalline deposits here as well. Yeah, probably I'd replace this, I think. And then I think the last thing we'll do today is drain the oil, take the filter off, let that all drain out overnight, and then we'll come back to it tomorrow, and we'll see what we can take off tomorrow. Okay, so we're going to continue with our strip down of this RB20. We're going to take the cam covers off, inspect the cams. They should be in the correct position for removing the head bolts, but if they're not, we'll move them. We'll keep on tearing through and see what we find. So this one is looking really good, really clean, no wear on any of the cam lobes. You can tell it's had regular oil changes, so looking pretty good so far. So again, looks really good. Certainly no cause for concern here, I think. So we'll keep progressing through. Now, what I'm going to do is remove the cams. You don't necessarily need to do this when removing the head, but I'm going to be doing it anyway to inspect everything, to go through with everything. All of the caps are marked for both the intake and the exhaust, but one thing to note is that the text needs to be lined up when you're stood on the exhaust side. So the caps read this way on exhaust, and they also read this way on the intake. So if you get these caps upside down, it won't turn because it's line board, but the good trick is to put the first cam cap on and then line everything up text wise based on the direction of the text on that first one. So all of the fasteners for the cam cover are PH3 or JIC, effectively 3s, Phillips, and there is one 8mm or PH2 bolt, which normally lives here, but in this one it was over here. Now all of the cam caps are 10mm bolts, and we'll remove them the same way you would install them. So if you were going to install this, you tighten this one up and work outwards. So we will undo these and work inwards. But firstly, we're going to take off these splash guards for the back of the cams, which are also 10mm. Something that can happen with these is the bolts kind of seize or bind in these caps. I've had it on a few RBs and I'm not really sure why, because obviously they went through that firstly okay when it was originally torqued for some reason, but now they bind. So the cap is loose, but the actual shank of the bolt is binding in here. So we need to be really careful with those because we don't want to snap any of these bolts off. So in the past I have had to sand down or use a Scotch pad on these bolts to get the right clearance for them to then turn freely in these housings. I'm not sure what causes this, it's a bit odd, but it's been the same on quite a few different RB20s I've taken apart. So this one here is seized, or certainly very tight in this housing, whereas this one spins freely. So all of these caps are marked, so you can see E3 there for exhaust cap 3, so you shouldn't be able to put these back in the wrong position. Well, I mean, you can put them back in the wrong position, but you should be able to see whether you have or haven't. Okay, now we're going to start taking the head bolts out. Okay, so we've got the head off. I've just cleaned up the gasket surface with a Stanley blade and just removed any debris. So the next thing for us to do is to take off the cam gear, or the crank gear even. So we need to take this off to take the oil pump out, to be able to take the crank out after the rods and pistons have been removed. And we need to take those out because we have some rust in some of the bores that we can take a look at later. So these are very difficult to take off in the RB20 for some reason. They seem to rust themselves onto the crank and are very difficult. I think I mentioned previously about all of the other ones, bar one I've had to do, ended up having to drill and tap the gear and destroy it to take it off. Some people seem to have been very lucky, and on one engine I've removed it by hand, just by chance. And Everything I've found on this engine so far is pretty well seized on, so I think this is going to be a bit of a struggle. So I'm going to go away and do this. Then I'm going to come back when it's done and show you what it took to get it off. Okay, I've tried to take the crank pulley gear off, but that doesn't want to play. So I'm going to leave that for now. We're going to take the sump off. We'll take all of the pistons and rods out. We'll unbolt the oil pump, and then we'll try pulling the gear off that way and see where we get to. So let's pull this off and see what we find inside. Okay, so we've got the sump off. Now we can start taking everything else off. So we'll take the oil pickup off next. Then we can either take off the main crank girdle, or we can start doing the rods and pistons. So to be honest, I think we'll take out the girdle and give ourselves a little bit of extra room, and then we'll start on the pistons. So the next thing we're going to do, so we've taken the crank girdle off, and all of the main bearings are looking really good, really nice. The condition of the crank is really good. So we're just going to take the piston oil squirters out now, so we don't damage any of those when we take our pistons out. So for this you need a multi-point metric 10mm socket, and if I didn't mention before, the main girdle bolts are all 17mm headed bolts. So these are the oil squirters here. I've now managed to get the crank gear off after a struggle. We tried the nice way. I've tried prying with screwdrivers. I've tried a little puller that I couldn't manage to get behind the gear. We've tried blow torches and quenching. We've tried more blow torches. And in the end, I've resorted to my favourite method, which is drilling down the centre and then popping a chisel through and splitting the gear and giving it some relief and then pulling it off. But you can see that it was rusted onto the crank pretty well. And as much as I hate breaking these, I found in my experience 90% of them on RB20s need to be split like this or drilled out and use a hub puller. But the idea here is you start just above the keyway by drilling a hole through on the outside, enlarging that hole to maybe around 8mm, then punching a cold chisel through it, cracking the gear and allowing you to pull it off. So unfortunately, there's another RB20 gear gone. I'll add it to my pile of RB20 gears because I've got quite a good collection of those now. So let's take the oil pump off and then we're near enough done with this disassembly. I've just covered this here while I was drilling out the bolt because you don't want any metal shavings to end up in here. So I've taken the bolts out, the oil pump, but now the crank gear's gone. Should be easy to pull this off. So here's the backing plate for the cam gear that we've had to destroy, but to be honest we could bend this back, but they're not expensive, they're about £2, so we'll just get another one. And there you have your oil pump. So we'll put this aside. As part of the disassembly, we'll inspect the gear inside here, make sure there's no cracking or damage, and make sure this is okay. But potentially we can reuse this as long as this gear is okay. Being the RB20, it's got the short nose snout, so definitely has risk of cracking this cam gear, but not oil pump gear, but not very common on RB20s for that to crack. So now the only thing holding the crank in is the rear main seal, which is just held in with 10mm bolts. So we'll go ahead and nip that off now. And there you have the rear main seal in its little housing. And with that, the engine disassembly is complete. And we can start any necessary repair work and get it put back together. So we'll finish this video there and we'll pick up next time on any of the parts I'm cleaning up and getting ready to put back together. So thanks for watching.